Thank you very much for the nice introduction. So actually he told everything, so we can spare this slide. So actually this time I'm not talking about Apache Lucene and no crazy stuff about Panama and so on, because I have a second job next to committing to Lucene, Solr and Elasticsearch is that we are archiving long-term archiving scientific data, especially from the geo and biosciences, environmental sciences. And that's also, by the way, the reason why you have a numerical search in Lucene, Solr and Elasticsearch, because we needed that at that point to have that. But because of what happened last year, I'm today not talking about Lucene, so I'm going back to the original area where I'm coming from, and that's scientific data. And with the election of Trump last year, everybody know Trump really says, okay, there's no climate change, and you also don't need any vaccines, so Masern is not an issue, and so on. So, and based on that, he started to somehow try to influence scientific data collection and also the whole usage of scientific data in publications and so on by just trying to shut down almost everything that has to do with science. So you might have seen those news reports about the Harvard University to be accused to not correctly handle immigrants and so on, but the main interest behind the whole thing is somehow to keep those scientists there or stopping them from working on their real projects, and that's one of the things. But he also used, so you might have seen those pictures from protesting scientists. One famous one is, for example, from the meteorological organization in the US. They are standing because I think half of them were lost their job, and that went through the news. But actually, the trick how to do that is if you, for example, look at the funding, then the grants from the National Science Foundation. So in the years before it was quite constant, but in 2025 suddenly it went down by a significant amount. So I would say it's between 20 and 30%. That is the funded grants. So in science, it's in most cases, if you don't get funding by your university, you have to apply for funding to do something like going out somewhere with a ship, taking measurements in the sea, measuring temperature, or you have some boys somewhere that measure the temperature in the water. So you need a grant to do that. And the trick somehow to stop that from working is by trying to limit the money that is given to those scientists. But that's not so easy to do. But because of an executive order, there's a lot of stuff that should be said in the US if you are part of an institution which is belonging to the state. So, for example, the National Science Foundation, because it's a National Science Foundation, is not allowed to use words in that list. So, the common ones, diversity is very, very important. Inclusion is also very important to never ever say that. There's a long list which is collected. You can also get that list on the webpage pen.org banned words list, for example. And based on that word list, so for example, this leaked at some point. There's, for example, some workflow. If you have applying for funding in the US, there's a simple workflow. Actually, when you look at that workflow, it's even simpler than that diagram because there's only two outcomes and the patterns are all the same. So, for example, if the reviewer of that grant is checking out if that applies, if it would further read it at all, they have to check if the title or abstract contain any of those words or terms or phrases. And if that's not the case, you can also go to the abstract and so on, and then at the end you may read the whole thing and don't reject it. But actually, for example, if you're measuring something outside in the ocean, and you, for example, you only want to figure out the diversity of some stone types in the Atlantic, then it would be rejected immediately. So that's the track here. I think the word list is really strange. So interestingly, woman is on the list, but man is not on the list. So that's interesting. So as soon as you talk about something which has to do with women, you're banned somehow. So social sciences also have problems. So that's actually the funny thing. And that also leads to the fact that most of the big institutions, like, for example, National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation that we have seen before, lost about 30%. So the most environmental protection agency is the one that lost most of their scientists or staff personnel, and the problem with that is if you have less personnel, you cannot do any science anymore, and that's basically what's wanted. And that immediately started the fact, because if you don't have personnel, you can also no longer maintain the databases that, for example, have climate data from the last 100 years. So there are databases at NOAA. NOAA is a national organization for atmospheric, for ocean and atmospheric agency, and they have, for example, data about the last 100 years of temperature data at several stations in the US and also worldwide. And the first thing was because there's no personnel anymore, and Trump said, no, there's no climate change, we need to shut that down. So actually, they started to decommission all those data sets, and they were no longer be possible to be downloaded. Actually, there was a date given on all those, so there was some. I think they tried to argue we give the people a little bit of time to maybe download or use the data sets, but actually some of those data sets didn't disappear at the end, but most of them already disappeared up to now. So actually we lost a lot of data and about climate change. And also there was some article 2 weeks ago. They also stopped using the infrastructure, for example, to measure that data points out there. So there's also no new data coming in. So that's one of the problems. So the typical reaction from Europe is, of course, hurry up, copy all the data. So that's actually what happened. And Pangaea is the data center I'm working for. We did the same. So just the background. So Pangaea is somehow a globally leading platform for fair data. I will explain what fair data means, because you here are not so really from the science. Data curation, data publication in the earth and environmental sciences. So we have a lot of climate data already, but not all of that climate data which is relevant for doing really science on that stuff. So what does fair mean? Fair is, it doesn't have anything to do with fairness, but it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You know, findable is because we are using Elasticsearch for our search engine, but it needs to be accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So there also needs to be the data and a lot of metadata together with it. And the problem with copying all that data from the US is that when you download those data sets at NOAA, for example, there is no metadata available, or the data is in some arbitrary, strange formats that you can only pass with software provided by them, which is also disappearing. And that's one of the problems. And because of that, if you want to preserve that data, you need to transform it in a format, try to get all the metadata about the stations, latitudes, longitudes, and all that information which is missing in the poor downloads. So you need to make it more fair. And that was because of there were no people anymore to can take care of that. This was missing for a great amount. So that's one thing that we do. But of course, if we need to add that metadata and try to figure out and talk to those scientists, that's hard to do. So for example, so this is just a history, not so interesting. So we exist since 1987, and so actually the data items here is 36 billion. So behind the scenes, we are not only using Elasticsearch, it's also Postgres. So actually we have one table with 36 billion data points, which is just a reference. This could be a numerical value, could also be a string value, or could be a pointer to some binary object, which could be a netcdf file or whatever. So actually that's the amount of data in the data sets from a lot of different types. And different types, so mostly is of course chemistry related, biological classification, and so on. So what types of plankton you can find somewhere in the sea, because from that you would need to know how healthy the ocean is at that point. So for example, if there's not enough oxygen in the ocean, it's you will see it goes down with the number of those small plankton or foraminiferas. And so actually all those data points, it's not only measurement of temperature, it's also measurement of the biodiversity and all that stuff to get an overview. And data set, for example, I just choose that data set because it was published in 2026. And this is, for example, here from western of California. So actually, this data set was not rescued by Pangea. This data set, just the scientists from there came to us because they had no chance to give it somewhere in the US. And because the project was somehow also funded by a European Union, I think, or no, in that is it's National Science Foundation here. So, for example, that was still possible to be funded, and we have a lot of metadata. So basically, if you're coming from the scientific area, you need a citation. So actually, the new things, you not only have the papers, scientific papers explaining that stuff, but you can also reference to the data sets, which also have a citation. So in your reference list of your paper, you're just citing the data set if you're using the data. That's basically how science works nowadays. And you also get a persistent identifier, so you can download that data set in different formats and use it in your workflows, for example. And you can also look here closer. You have a lot of measurement variables here. In that one, you can go into the data matrix and figure it out. This is not so large. I think it's a smaller data set. But basically, the most important thing is to use the data set, you can take that link here, which normally, if you use it in your browser, goes to the landing page. But if you, for example, have an app, the typical approach for apps to access to the data is that you're using content negotiation on HTTP, on the HTTP request to directly get it, for example, in a specific format. And this is also a standardized way that's used by a lot of data centers around the world, and it's belonging to that FAIR principles. So you can directly access the data. You only need to know the persistent identifier. For a paper, it would be a PDF file, but in that case, you can get the data in any case. So actually, that's how it works. So after that announcement by the National Science Foundation that they won't find any projects anywhere, NOAA starting to shut down data sets. So actually a lot of scientists came without, actually partly they were anonymously contacting us, for example, that they wanted to give their data away to have it there somewhere outside of the US in a data center. So actually it was not on our side to copy that data, but the scientists came directly and tried to archive the data on our side. And that lead actually to to the problem that we were not able to work anymore because somehow posted it on LinkedIn, I think, and then every week there was a camera team from some German TV, or we also had some US radio stations asking us, so we were not able to work anymore, but that was just a funny part here on that one. But actually copying the data is not easy, because if you copy the data, you just get raw data files. You have to add all that metadata which is missing. In most cases, the US American data centers don't have anything like that content negotiation, fair access to the data sets, so you have to spend a lot of work to make that data available. And because of that, in this year, we had a meeting 2 months ago in Berlin, where it was by invitation only. So a lot of scientists from the US came here. The list of attendees is not publicly available. And we were discussing here about how to make the whole thing resilient, so we can get the data into safe guards in outside of the US, and what possibilities are there. So actually the problem that you have is it's not only people like Trump, you also have natural disasters like, for example, the Hurricane Helene broke a data center in Asheville. For some time, you also have the direct risks, infrastructural, personal risks. But actually the problem is you have to take care before actually that happens. And that was the discussion on those meetings, to somehow get a possibility to figure out which data sets are important. So you have rescuability, because some data sets are on tape archives only, so it takes weeks, months, or even years to get them out of the country. So it's not so easy. So you have to be prepared to only preserve those data sets which are relevant. And one of the things that you could do is that you need multi-format metadata. So actually the US Americans are now also working. They get funding outside of NSF by private companies to get better metadata on their data centers. You need something like integrated data storage, so you can download those data sets and save it, for example, in Europe as a possibility to get them live again after something. So you need a portable packaging, and you need to put that in a transparent way to the outside, so everybody could jump into that. And you need to work together, the data centers globally, and it should be unspecific to funding and so on. So that's here nice picture that I found on the internet. But if you want to get more about that, you can also have that nice overview picture. I let it be generated by AI. But the only problem that I have here is this looks like tombstones, but should not be. Yeah. So actually, I think so. We have 2 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Uwe.
Thank you very much for the talk. Yeah, very, depressing.
It's depressing, I know. Yeah, I'm still laughing, but that's how I'm behaving.
Very understandable.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, how do you see how much of a problem is on the side of scientists for all these years not getting any kind of agreement on how they store the data? And like, I'm thinking about the data sets. I've been in science for some time, and I'm not sure I can trust them either, because what they could have measured as biodiversity 5 years ago might be very different from what they measure right now.
That's
So in a way, like, semantic layer around this data might be more useful to preserve than the raw data. And like, do you see any shift in scientists finally approaching this problem and getting some standards that probably industry already developed, or anything in that direction?
Yeah, actually, this is one thing, so it changes. So actually, the problem was in the past, the scientists didn't want to give away their data at all. So that was the most important thing, because somebody else could find out something with the data they haven't figured out, and because of that, they didn't want to give it away. Nowadays, it got a little bit better, because, for example, you only get the funding also from the NSF and other agencies, if you make sure that the data is available after your project. So just writing a paper, giving your results without the data behind in an open, accessible way is no longer funded. That's one way. And the other thing is, I agree with missing metadata. I know, so metadata is very, very important, but actually you also have to preserve the old data, because you can see differences, like biodiversity changes, you have counts of microorganisms in the sea. This is really hard. So, and you need some semantic layers also on top. So a lot of other stuff is, of course, we store it also in our Elasticsearch, is annotations of terminologies that are related. So you can also search for species, genus, and so on, to find data sets which are maybe closely related to that specific part you're looking for. So that's also important. And yeah.
Thank you again, Uwe. Time is over. I think you stay here a little bit for questions, and yeah, have a nice rest of the day.